The Centre for Development and Enterprise has released a report flagging their concerns that South Africa doesn't have a proper growth strategy. In fact, the CDE goes so far as to say poor policies have led almost to an anti-growth strategy. Just in the past week, we've heard exciting plans about investment for green hydrogen projects. Hardly a week goes by without plans and pledges around big infrastructure being announced. So what's going wrong? What's getting in the way of real growth? I'm joined now by Bernstein at the Centre for Development and Enterprise. And thank you so much for joining us. You've written that over the past 15 years, average growth rates have done nothing but fall. What is getting in the way of our growth?
Hi, Sally. It's great to be with you.
Great to be with you too.
There are three things that are causing South Africa's decline. The first are bad policy choices, and there are too many of those. The second is the way in which we are governing the country, from local government to the way in which we implement things very badly. And then we've had a devastating lack of leadership. And the combination of these three has led to a growing loss of confidence in South Africa and its future. And this affects investment dramatically.
Where would you put issues of corruption? Because the reality as well is that our country has been hit by devastating state capture, where skills and money have just leached out of key entities. And we are on a bit of a repair mission. How has that impacted our growth prospects?
I think you have to think about corruption, which has been horrific, industrial scale, but you also have to think about cadre deployment. And what has happened is that this policy of the government is that you appoint people because they're loyal to the party and the party's cause, much more than they're fit for purpose. So we put people in charge of very big infrastructure budgets, vitally important institutions, and yet they have divided loyalties between the party and their fiduciary responsibility to their institution. And many of them are totally inappropriate for the very large projects and budgets and institutions they're supposed to run. So it's this terrible combination of corruption at the very heart of government and throughout government institutions and cadre deployment, which has led to really the collapse of vital institutions from Eskom to Transnet, where we have this bizarre and very bad situation for the economy, where the services that are provided are more and more expensive, but they're providing less and less adequate services, from too little power to the ports, rail, and now roads, but all in decline.
I mean, if we look at someone like Andre de Ruyter, he was absolutely not a cadre. In fact, he hates the word. He didn't manage to turn anything much around at Eskom. I mean, some people say he did try and draw a line around corruption, but I think the jury's out on how much he's achieved. Is it just that it's too little, too late?
Well, I think you have to look at where we are as a country. So we have a government with a cabinet of mediocrities at best and serious vested interests at worst. So the cabinet is not fit for purpose overall. Of course, I think the Treasury is a solid institution, still doing a great job, and the Reserve Bank. But it's hard to think of many other places in government that are performing at a barely adequate level, never mind excelling. So right at the heart of government, we have a cabinet that is divided and that is not filled with people who are the best in South Africa. So that's a real problem. And I think there has been a failure of leadership. When the president of the country says that the unity of his political party is more important than then the future of South Africa, a whole lot of very bad consequences have flown from that. Yeah. And I think that is one of the root causes of South Africa's problems today.
So when you talk about it's almost an anti-growth strategy, is that because when you don't have someone taking clear charge and saying, I'm sorry if some of these decisions are uncomfortable, but this is the way we've got to go in order to grow, there isn't one person doing that? Because I think the counter-argument is that the government probably would say, well, we are emerging from years of state capture. We are more than aware of the problems. It's just taking a very long time to sort it out. Do you think it really boils down to lack of leadership?
I think there are a number of factors. We have lots of documents that say we want growth. We have lots of documents that say we want jobs. But when you actually look at what government does, they introduce many policies that contradict what business needs in order to grow. So they interfere in how companies are run. They tell companies you have to buy products that are made in South Africa. Think about it. They have a localization strategy that says to Transnet, you must buy locomotives in South Africa. It took Transnet months and months and months to get permission to buy locomotives elsewhere because South Africa does not produce locomotives. So we keep interfering, contradicting what is required in order to get growth to happen. So I think there isn't a prioritization. We've got long laundry lists of what we want to do in South Africa, but the items on that laundry list contradict each other. The president has a list of reforms, many of which are good reforms. They're taking an unbelievably long time to implement, and you have to ask why. Do we have the right people running large institutions, whether it's government departments or big parastatals? And the answer invariably is no.
You've also cited your concerns that broad-based black economic empowerment, you believe that can also hinder growth. That's a tough one because we have to redress the past. So how do we get that right? And how is BBBEE getting in the way of growth, in your view?
I don't think there's any sensible South African who doesn't believe we need far more black South Africans at every level of the economy, whether it's as workers, because we have the world's highest unemployment rate, or whether it's as industrialists. So that is not the issue. The question is, how do you do that? Now, the government's tried all sorts of things, from BBBEE to many other things. They're going to create 100 industrialists. It's not working. So you have to say, we have a terrible education system, so the pipeline is very, very narrow in terms of producing the skills we need for a modern economy. You then have to say, if our economy excludes vast numbers of workers, we're a global outlier when it comes to the number of people eligible to work of the right age who are actually working. We sit with a 42% unemployment rate. So there are a whole lot of things that would actually empower millions and millions of South Africans, but instead we've chosen particular legislative instruments that actually raise the costs of doing business in South Africa. And people forget we're competing with many other countries for investment. Why would anyone want to invest here when you have to give away a significant proportion of your company or investment before you've even started? So there are a whole lot of things where we are making it harder and harder and more expensive to operate in South Africa. This is not the right way to empower millions and millions of people, which I am totally in favor of.
So last week we heard about the green hydrogen plans. It seemed like there were lots of keen investors. Money, I think, is already on the table. That suggests that investors are still looking to South Africa as a place where business can be done. So are they not seeing the full picture? Are they just seeing the problems as opportunities? Or do you think that the green hydrogen project might not actually make it?
Well, I don't know anything about green hydrogen, but what I do know is that as Eskom has failed and the government has allowed, initially very reluctantly, but now with more enthusiasm, private generation of power, the market is responding. Investors are responding out of necessity, but also out of seeing opportunities from crisis. And the only growth industry of any significance at the moment is in alternative sources of power. This is good. We also need to invest in the grid so that distribution can take place. And it would be nice if we had one person in charge of energy policy for the country and not 5 different ministers.
And I want to ask you about how you define growth, because some people simply look at GDP, but there's also the worry about jobless growth. And I think there's a broader understanding of what growth is, which means that people thrive and people live a good life. How do you define growth? At what point will you say, yes, we are on the right track?
I don't think we had jobless growth in South Africa. People talk about this in the 2000s when we did have 5% growth per annum for a few wonderful years. In fact, we grew 2 million more jobs in that period. So I don't think there is jobless growth in South Africa. That's the first point. The second is we need much faster growth, which is much more labor intensive. So it's no good pushing wages and costs higher and higher and higher. You'll get less investment. And there are very few developing countries that have been able to develop and get out of being developing to developed societies without going through a phase of low-skill manufacturing. But South Africa says, no, that's not good enough for us. That's not the kind of growth we want. We want high-wage, high-skill manufacturing. That's great, but we don't have a high-skill workforce because we have failed to educate people properly and our training system is very bad. So you have to have the kind of growth approach for a country like South Africa, and it needs to be as fast as possible. So the faster growth is the more you can increase the cost, the sort of quality of life for millions and millions of people. So you need more firms, they must pay their taxes, but then their tax money must be spent properly so we get value for money. And we're not doing that. So we've got to get growth going. It's not the answer to everything, but without growth, we're not going to be able to deal with our growing rate of poverty, nearly 60% of the country, and we're not going to be able to change the lives of millions and millions of people. So there is a virtuous circle here. Unfortunately, South Africa isn't benefiting from it because we're doing the opposite.
So, Anne, I mean, there's so much in this, and you've told us so much this evening. You've spoken about how there's clear division within the cabinet on how, for example, to grow energy. That needs to be sorted out. There are lots and lots of plans, some of which are really, really good. You need leadership to come together with expertise to say this is the right direction. This is how we go forward. Tomorrow we're getting the jobs figures out. We heard earlier in the show from PPC Cement saying they're stockpiling cement. These projects are not happening quickly enough. If I had to say to you, where would you start? Which is so hard because there are so many desperate needs. What would be the first thing you'd like to see change?
I don't think there is either low-hanging fruit in South Africa or easy answers. Now, some people would say to you, I want power, I want the ports to work. My answer is, I'd like the president to stand up and say the interests of this country supersede those of my party. And if I'm thrown out, so be it. But this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to fire the following ministers, and I'm going to give them deadlines. New ministers with deadlines for delivery. And if they don't deliver, people must go. we continually have people who never meet deadlines, departments who don't deliver, ministers who disagree with the president in public. What is going on? So we don't seem to have either a foreign policy of any coherence or an economic strategy that makes sense, or the people in place, whether it's Transnet or any department you care to name, actually, almost any, except for Treasury, we don't seem to have the right people in place. So how do you deliver if you don't have competent people at the top?
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Absolutely fascinating. Anne Bernstein's from the Centre for Development and Enterprise, a very interesting article on what is getting in the way of growth. I believe it's a two-part series. They're also going to be speaking about where we go next, but you did certainly get a sense from Anne